to the Women Arise podcast. I'm your host, Neely Hicks, and in today's episode, you'll find hope in Alaska by having the courage to name historical oppression. Reverend Murray Crookes' community is progressing towards the goals of truth and reconciliation. And as they revisit trauma, they also provide healing circles with the support of Triumph Over Trauma. Listen now. Hi, Murray. I'm so happy that you can be with us today.
Very glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks. Well, I want to go ahead and jump in. I'm really excited about this interview because I've been reading about Reverend Murray Crookes, and I want to get started by letting him share a bit about himself with you.
Outstanding. Well, let's see. I was just reflecting on how I was born here in Alaska in Ketchikan, though I've never claimed it as home because we lived on a logging camp when I was born out in the water. So we had to go into the city so I could be born. Consider Sitka, Alaska to be my hometown. And I spent a significant amount of time in my life in the South when my stepdad built oil tanks. And so if you ever hear a Southern accent creep out, it's because I lived a huge portion of my life in Oklahoma, South Carolina, Southern Louisiana, very near Baton Rouge, and various other places. And then, let's see, I did go to high school and college and seminary, all in Oklahoma. And then while I was in seminary, I served in the Oklahoma Conference. I started there, and then in the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference before I was recruited to come and plant a church here in Anchorage. So I was finally able to return home after, home to Alaska. Anchorage has only been home since 2018.
Okay.
But yeah, got quite of an adventure. That's the real short version.
Yeah. I'm excited to hear about all the different places that you've been, because I know in my life, the more places I go, the more it develops me, my insights, my wisdom, my knowledge, just all of that stuff. And so it's exciting to hear where you're from and where you are now. And so I want to go ahead and turn to where you are now. And I want you to tell us about the ministry that you're doing. I've been reading an article that was written by United Methodist News, and it is really insightful. First of all, I want to begin with your name, Reverend Murray Crookes, and I read that your last name brings kind of a mystical experience to people around you there, because your great-grandfather was the last medicine man there, right?
Well, technically, I've actually just learned this year he wasn't the last medicine man.
Okay.
But
Good.
The one that came after him died very young. So my great-grandfather may have actually outlived him. I don't know the dates and times of all those things, but I'm learning a little bit about that now, and it's kind of crazy stuff that nobody talks about. But
yeah, well, I think it's really interesting that.
I point out the name isn't Crookes. My Crookes name. Forgive me for interrupting. My Crookes name comes from my grandfather, who was an immigrant from England, and he came through Canada and then met my grandmother. And my grandmother's family were the loggers, and they all migrated out of central Canada into southeast Alaska. And so my dad is Canadian, although he lives in Washington now. And so that's where my Crookes name comes from. My grandmother's name, though, her maiden name was Walanga. And her dad, my great-grandpa, was Walanga. And so when they gave out names, because they had to have a first and last name because of the the interaction with Westerners at that point. That's when all of his descendants just acquired his name as their last name. And that's the name that I was surprised to find out had so much meaning here in Anchorage. So that people really are interested in who I am because of that.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. That's important, an important fact. And for me, symbolically, just looking at that spirit of healing running throughout your family is powerful. I've been reading about how you bring community together in your church, and so I'd like to invite you to share about that.
You bet. Well, let's see. There for about 5 years, we called ourselves Every Nation United Methodist Church, and the big the big thing before the pandemic was coming together and eating and singing and doing Bible study, and we do that every Tuesday. And we had quite a large group and a lot of great musicians that would come, and it was just full of life and goodness. And we even had a music group that would go out and sing in the community. Uh, that same music group, in fact, we just sang last night at an event called Native Musicale, where people come from all over the state during Fur Rendezvous, which is a huge celebration uh, at the beginning of the Iditarod that happens here in Anchorage. But then, of course, the pandemic happened, and we tried to focus on uh, doing works in the community instead of focusing on our meals and our worship. And so we started an organization called Alaska Native Hope Network, and hope in that context stands for History of Oppression, Project of Empowerment. And so then we kind of had those two things going in tandem. And then this year, uh, at the end of the summer, we reflected on the things that we were doing and decided that if we continue to try to have a church going and a nonprofit going, that there's a solid chance we couldn't do either one well. And so we combined them, and we kept the name that the people came up with Alaska Native Hope, and we dropped the network at the end. And so now we identify ourselves as Alaska Native Hope,
Beautiful.
and that encompasses all the work that we're doing. And we still have our meals, and we still worship on Sundays. And now we are looking at doing some more exciting things in the community. Like I said, combining that work together.
Wonderful. So in describing hope, you said history of oppression,
Mm-hmm.
program of empowerment. And so I want to pause there at the HO
Or
part and
project of empowerment.
project of empowerment. And so I want to go into that history of oppression and just listen to you talk a bit about that as it pertains to the setting where you are now.
All right. Well, as an Alaska Native man and as a Native person in the world, really, but uh, we're looking at Alaskan America here. Um, the fact that most of us don't speak our indigenous languages as our primary language is evidence that we are survivors of historic trauma, right? We didn't give up our culture and language without significant amount of struggle. And so the history of oppression that we're looking at is examining who we are and what things have happened to to make things the way that they are, right? And in acknowledging that history of oppression, we see a certain number of trends, right? That one that we're looking at right now in this season is looking at the harm that was done to indigenous people by the church that was acting uh, as a representative of the state in the assimilation and uh, cultural genocide of Alaska Native people, which happened right alongside a number of other terrible events like plagues and massive
Yes.
uh, waves of death that came because of sickness uh, that happened prior to the cultural genocide, of course, that occurred in what we generally refer to as the boarding school era.
Yes.
Fun little fact, the boarding school era in the world started right here in Alaska with a Presbyterian pastor named Sheldon Jackson. And he started the method to, as they said, kill the Indian and save the man
Mhm.
at the Wrangell Institute in Southeast Alaska, and
Mhm.
that method of bringing people to these schools to assimilate them and to eradicate their culture and language uh, spread throughout the country and became the official position of the United States in dealing with indigenous people. Right alongside that, when the Constitution said that all Native people in the Americas could become citizens of the United States with a small caveat, as long as they spoke English and were civilized.
Mm.
Uh, People don't like to look at the second half of that when they're like, when did
Right.
Native people become citizens of this country? And so
So,
that's kind
yes.
of what we're wrestling with as being either people who have survived that experience or the descendants of people that have survived that experience. That's a common thing that every one of us shares. And it's worth looking at if we want to heal from it, right? When we talk about the history of oppression, right, most people for generations have said, that's in the past, we're not going to look at it. And we continue to recycle harmful behaviors and practices and ways of engaging in relationships with each other because we haven't been looking at it and acknowledging it for what it is. And so, with the project of empowerment involves looking at that history, acknowledging it, having the people who were culpable for it or who were complicit with it to acknowledge that did happen. We participated in it or didn't stop anyone from doing it, and we're committed to condemning that behavior and doing what we can to live in a healthy way, knowing that that behavior is behind us.
Exactly. We've got to deal with the past. I mean, we can't
Absolutely.
just act like it never happened or, compartmentalize it because the harm from it always comes back up. I want to ask you because you've shared a lot and it's so important for us to absorb all of these different things. But I want to move into you talking about how the church played a role in that assimilation bit. And then now you are in the church.
Hmm.
And so what are some of the complexities in being in that space that was once held by oppressors at the
Right.
local level? I mean, there's still oppressors throughout the church. So let
Absolutely.
me just say that. Yeah.
That's
But
right.
what does that feel like for you?
Well, it's an honor, honestly, to do that for a number of different reasons. But there was a thing called the Comity Agreement here in Alaska, where all the denominations, which excluded the Methodist Church at the time, said we just acquired this land from Russia and we need to civilize it. And so they chopped up Alaska into little pieces. And so they gave each denomination a little piece of of the the map and said, "You go take those people, and we'll go take these people." And that was an agreement that they had with the government to civilize, if you will, Alaska. And then, of course, once that got coupled with the boarding schools, then the state sponsored and paid for the building of these boarding schools, and the churches who were already established in these particular regions took the role of administrating and running and doing all of the things the, that were so harmful in the boarding schools themselves. And so that relationship between the church and the state. Now, with United Methodist, or back then they were just Methodists, I suppose, since they were cut out of the initial agreement, they got some land that they were given the duty of going to in the western islands of the state, and they found that when they got there, that there was already a Russian Orthodox presence there, and because the Russian Orthodox Church was engaging with these tribes and people in their own languages and had gone there and learned about their culture and was like engaging them in that kind of a way. Of course, the evangelical Methodist message wasn't landing there, and so the Methodist Church failed in establishing a presence in these places. But they did notice that there were a lot, or they, I would say that they capitalized, and this is the part of our history that most Methodists don't know. They capitalized on policies that during the boarding school era, after large swaths of people died, there were a large number of orphaned children in these villages where they were going. And so, where the Methodist Church did find that they could establish themselves was in the building of orphanages, where they would do the work of assimilating the students and such. But because so many parents died in these villages, when the United Methodist elders would go out by boat and find these kids, they would cause extra harm to the villages and the communities, because by taking the kids of those survivors, they were essentially taking their hope of the future away from an already destroyed by plague, if you will, situation. So causing trauma upon trauma. And then because there were so many kids, the orphanages that they had built didn't have enough capacity for all the kids that they were sending. And so then they would send those kids down into places like Portland and Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where a number of them died while they were in those places. So much so that even today we have relationship with the city of Portland, who are trying to find out ways that they can take care of the grave sites of Alaska Native people in Portland, just from the number of kids that died during that time. That's just one example.
Yes.
Not to mention all the people that are trying to bring the remains back from Carlisle, the kids that died there, which is on a military base, and so they can't even go to the location, let alone get their those people and bring their bodies home.
Exactly. It's overwhelming, the destruction that is left behind.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you about like the effects of trauma that you're seeing now within your community. Can you share some of that?
Absolutely. But before I do, you asked, how does it feel for me
Yes.
to be a pastor and an elder, knowing that that is the history of what people in my position have done in the past? And I'll answer that question first, because that's where I was going, even though I rambled a little bit. You see, I know that God and Jesus and the church are so much more than that reality. And if I don't live that out in my faith walk and show that we live in a church that can stand up for what's right, that can stand up against oppression, and can stand for justice, and can do so as a disciple of Jesus, then I, you know, I don't know when there will be another opportunity for such a thing to happen. Right. My testimony in my life, as a reflection of, as a disciple of Jesus, says that I believe that God and Jesus and the church are a lot more than the sum of the horrible things that have happened.
Yes.
Right. I get
Yeah,
my
that's what
my
keeps me
hope.
in it too.
Yeah. And if I just gave up and walked away and tried to find a denomination that didn't have blood on their hands, right? When we're looking at history, then I'd probably run off to a monastery someplace and live apart from the world. But I serve a really good God, and I want to share that with people. And part of that is acknowledging reality, which isn't always convenient.
Hmm.
So
Yes, and
that's for me personally.
thank you. I really appreciate you bringing that all of that up because I think it is so important to look at the past and especially when we're talking about trauma, we need to know what happened. What
Yeah,
happened? And so as you're delving into that within your community, I know that you, as I do, like working in any community, we see the effects of trauma and they vary from place to place, from person to person.
yeah,
But as pastors, we stand right there in the midst of it all. So
that's right.
could you describe a bit of what you're seeing happening now within your community?
Absolutely. So there are obvious things that are happening in the community. There are a number of um, social challenges that are well documented, such as missing and murdered Indigenous women, high rates of incarceration, particularly amongst Native men. There's a large transient and homeless population of Native people, particularly here in Anchorage and in urban areas of the state that are visible. Uh, Native people are routinely stereotyped as being alcoholics and addicts and abusers of women and children. And we have the highest rates of suicide among just about any people in the world. And the list goes on. There is so much stuff that is going on that even up into my 30s, people were saying, well, maybe Native people are just genetically predisposed to these things, because they would rather think that we were built wrong than to admit that we are suffering from really terrible history that we're not even aware of because no one's talking about it, right? So that's the reality of trauma that we're going up against. And so I see all of those things, and I also see a continuation of those practices of assimilation, in that the many of the native Christians that I encounter on a regular basis who are Christian embrace a really narrow understanding of Christianity that is very evangelical, very focused on individual salvation, and doesn't, I would say, doesn't address the challenges of oppression and justice and in systems of those of oppression and injustice, in a way that is healing for the community. Once again, I would say that is because of the individual focus that's combined with teachings that said, um, out, this is would be Christian teachings that say what we believe is the only way to believe, and everyone else is wrong.
Right.
And so, when the state was divided up into all those denominations, you get factions that fight against each other, uh, theologically,
Yeah.
that point fingers and say those Christians over there are evil, or those people aren't even Christian at all, rather than acknowledging that we serve a Savior who came to make us whole.
Yeah. Which we can't be because we keep poking holes in one another.
I
So
know.
it's awful. It's awful. Well, so I want I want to ask you, because we've met through the work Triumph Over Trauma, which is
Yes.
a program that Harper Hill Global and the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors have developed together to get this important psychological education and coping kit out to communities abroad, like throughout the United States. And you were the first person from Alaska to reach out and let me know that you were doing something with it there. So I want to ask, first of all, like, how did you find out about it? And secondly, how are you using it?
Well, Carol Easton, who is one of the authors of the Native community portion of Triumph Over Trauma training, she and I are colleagues. I just started working as a faculty for Native American course of study, and working very closely with Carol. And so, because of Carol, I learned about Triumph Over Trauma, and started the training, and saw that it coincided perfectly with this work that I'm doing uh, with historical trauma. And so I got my little team. We signed up and did the training, and we're planning to have an event where we'll be doing trauma healing circles over the course of 6 months, as we wrestle with this history of trauma. And then after we have those healing circles, we're going to offer a truth telling summit for people to share their reality, particularly with church leaders, in a way that can pave the way for right relationships. But I would share something else with you, something that's happening because of this work. I am encountering a lot of people who are looking to sign up for the April 11th training.
Good.
So I wouldn't be surprised if there are 20 or more people that have undergone Triumph Over Trauma training, um, and then many of them are doing that training to participate in this work that I'm doing. But we're inviting people from you know a lot of different intersectional areas to do that work. And our hope is to create a community of people who are dedicated to um, dealing with trauma. And the thing that would connect us is our Triumph Over Trauma training, so that we can support each other in that work. And so that the community that's built isn't just something that is propping up somebody's church or program, or something of that nature, but can create a very organic relational community that's dedicated to healing, that
That's
is bigger
beautiful.
than any one of our pet projects. And so um, that is the cool new thing that's happening with regard to Triumph Over Trauma training that's developing as of just yesterday. Having that discussion with some people.
I've been noticing the registrations going up, and I've seen several that are from Alaska and some from Hawaii.
Oh,
So
cool.
yeah, so I don't know if that's part of Carol and Michelle's work or not, but I mean it's happening, and it's just great. I think one of the things with Triumph Over Trauma is that you can really be so creative with the way that you use it. Right now, I'm using it in a weekly open online meeting just to make sure that people know that Thursday nights at 6 p.m. they have a place to go, that
Yeah,
where they can feel safe and supported while gaining knowledge and then personal insight on how trauma and the effects of trauma are impacting their lives, and then learning some new coping skills. So that's one way that I use it. I also find it really useful in when I prepare funerals. I do that way differently from how I used to, because we've got to look at the factors of forgiveness, and letting someone go, forgiving ourselves, forgiving them, so many aspects. And in preaching and teaching, I use it. It's made me feel like I can see people at a different level than I did before, in how they may receive a message maybe differently because of their life history, or generational history. So I don't know if you're finding any of these things yet to be true for you in just daily interactions or church ministry.
I would. It's hard to tell and the reason is before I was a pastor, I was a inpatient substance abuse counselor, CDC one here in the state of Alaska, and I worked at a Indian Health Services treatment center and helped get people off of drugs and alcohol. And so we've been addressing. Back then, we called it multi generational grief, but today I would describe it as historical trauma. So I've been aware of that for a while, but I'm much more closer to it now as I engage it as a pastor than I did when dealing with isolated individuals as a counselor. And so it certainly does inform the way I preach and teach, and especially informs how I interact with the Bible and my Bible teaching, because I recognize the struggle and the trauma that's present in the Bible, and
Exactly.
and find that that is a much more meaningful area to explore aspects of the Bible than some sort of uh, critical examination of the words and the context.
So true. So true. And it's funny because often we steer clear of those scriptures that feel like, oh, it's too scary. I don't want to bring these things up. Am I going to be ripping off a bandage, reopening an old wound or whatever? And when we find the courage to go there, it helps people feel seen. Like,
Yeah,
oh, this happened to people way back then too, and people who were faithful to God. And yeah, I've experienced something similar, and there's still hope. There's
yeah,
still hope. And I think it's so freeing when we do when we do delve into those really tough scriptures. So,
absolutely.
yeah. Well, Murray, our time is about, but I just want to invite you to add any final remarks, whether it's just something that is a hope for your work or a quote that particularly guides you in life? You've got the floor.
Well, I've got a lot of hope uh, in the work that we're doing uh, because I don't know. It's how about this? I I went to another training the other day, and the icebreaker was, what is something that helps you connect to other people? And people were like going through these kind of like easy answers. And when it came to me, I said, you know what? When I can identify shared trauma with people, that really helps me connect with them. It threw them for a loop. But I was like, look, when you can recognize shared trauma in another person, then you can really deeply identify with them and be empathetic with them and relate to them on a way that is more meaningful than whether or not they've got a baseball cap on from a team that you like. You know?
Exactly. Yeah, it's actually seeing the person, not just the body.
Yeah. And so I'm really hopeful that this work that has been started uh, with these trauma healing circles, um, I'm hopeful that at least here in Alaska, that it has the potential to become a movement of healing that can result in lasting social change. Remember
Yes.
when I listed that long list of things that people see and identify with Alaska Native people here in the state, negative statistical interests. I'm hopeful that the work that we do in our trauma healing circles will begin to reverse all of those symptoms, right? That there will be less suicide, that there will be fewer missing and murdered Indigenous women, that people that deal with their trauma will be more likely to become housed, that men coming out of uh, incarceration uh, might be empowered enough in their humanity that they could go home. And there will be more men in the villages, more Native men in the world instead of locked behind bars. Um, you know, less violence, right? All of those things, less addiction, because people might have the opportunity to confront the challenges and the reality that we face instead of either fighting it or hiding from it in some way. And I'm really grateful to have this tool to help me be a part of that movement. I know it's been a huge part of my life, and one of the reasons that I'm a healthy uh, human being today. And I've hoped that other people can utilize that to find their own health and wholeness.
Murray, I can't thank you enough. This has been a real genuine and just beautiful conversation. Lots that we have to learn, not being Native American. For those who are listening, I just encourage you to read more and to listen to more podcasts where people are talking about things like this. And because the more we know, the more we can understand, the more we can understand the trauma that does come out of having this kind of history. And once we know, just like your plan is to do like a truth and reconciliation at the end of the 6 months, I think that's what's needed. Like we have to lay out the things that we've done without, I mean, there's fear behind it, but it's also like it's cleansing because you can't be healed until you actually admit what's wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that as we do more of this in small communities and large ones, I think it can become a movement and can help us provide a more just world and loving world.
Hmm.
So on that note, we'll go ahead and close out for today. But Murray, I will list your contact information and everything in the description box so people can follow up. with you. And I want to thank all of you for listening. Have a
Thank you
good
very
day.
much. Bye
Thank
bye.
you. If you would like to contribute to Triumph Over Trauma, go to harperhill.global/donate. Your contributions will help us continue to train and mentor Triumph Over Trauma groups in the United States and abroad.